Thank you. Uh, okay. Thanks a lot, Natalie. I appreciate that introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. I was pretty excited to see the South Florida Wildlife Center when they asked us to give a talk, and we got a lot of things going on at Wildlands Conservation. Some of the people on board have seen most of these talks or are familiar with it, but other people, I'm sure, are quite new to it. So I'm going to start first by just introducing who Wildlands is as an organization and what we do, and then jump right into some background on tortoises and these upland skink species here. So Wildlands Conservation, we're a Tampa-based nonprofit organization. There's about 7 of us, so we're quite small. And our mission as a nonprofit is pretty much summed up right in our name. So we do what we can to help protect wildlands. So um, we work on land preservation, helping landowners, both public and private entities, get land in conservation. We help manage those lands. So we operate a little bit as a land trust. We operate as land managers. And in addition to that, we do a lot of research and education. And our role, or my role with the organization, is I direct our research efforts. So I'll be focused on some of the research that we're doing, and I do a lot of training in conjunction with FWC to train people to do gopher tortoise relocations, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. But there's a lot of else that we do that I'm not super involved with because I'm tied up with those two tasks primarily. But we do a lot of land management and outreach as well. Uh, so my overview, I just realized, is a little bit out of order here, but I'm going to talk about introductions to gopher tortoises, Florida sand skinks, and blue-tailed mole skinks. I'm going to talk about threats to upland habitats in Florida, and then the last two things I guess I didn't clean up. Those things actually come in the introduction, but I'm going to talk about some of our research efforts, what we're doing as an organization, and focusing on given the threats to these species and what we're working on. So again, starting off with the basics, I'm sure everybody here is quite familiar with what a tortoise is, but we'll take a broad view, and I'll do the same thing with the skinks in here, looking from an evolutionary perspective, narrowing down what they are. So the tortoise is a turtle. And turtles are weird vertebrates. So there's been a little bit of controversy, still some confusion about what other vertebrates are most closely related to turtles. So if you look at morphological characteristics, we know that birds and crocodilians are relatively closely related, going back to before dinosaurs. Birds are dinosaurs, but crocodilians are their closest living relatives. But then there's some uncertainty about whether turtles are more closely related to that group, or if lizards and snakes, those things that are lepidosaurs, are more closely related. We do know that mammals, for terrestrial vertebrates, are sort of an outgroup. But then the sort of broad umbrella of reptiles includes turtles, lizards, snakes, crocodilians, and birds in there. And that's, again, more fascinating thing in terms of where things have evolved. But it looks probably like turtles are a sister group to those birds and crocodilians. Maybe group them with crocodilians or not, but the jury's still a little bit out on that. But like I said, turtles are tortoises are turtles, but not all turtles are tortoises. So it's a frog and toad similar thing, right? Toads are a type of frog. Not all frogs are toads. So there's lots of non-tortoise turtles out there, and tortoises are just a specific group within the order Testudines in that class. So and the closest relatives of the tortoises, as the family of tortoises, are going to be in the amidid turtles. So if we just look at the groups of turtles that we have in Florida, We have soft shells, which, as you might guess, are pretty weird, bizarre turtles. They don't have the hard carapace and everything else like that. They're sort of the most distinctly related group of turtles that we have in Florida. And then in the other groups, we have the sea turtles, which are all relatively closely related. And then sort of grouping off from them, you have snapping turtles and the little kind of sternids. The mud and musk turtles are relatively closely related, grouping with that. And then tortoises and box and water turtles form another group on there. And so box turtles, even though they have a lot of tortoise-like features for being adapted to land, are actually more evolutionarily closely related to the sliders and the cooters and the river and pond turtles we're used to seeing around. But again, we're just going to focus mostly on the tortoises and on those turtle characteristics. So everybody, I think, is pretty familiar with them having a shell that surrounds their hips and their shoulders. So their sort of spine is curved in and the ribs have expanded in a shell where they have an upper carapace and a lower plastron. Again, I'm not going to go over those things in too much detail. And then the tortoises have adapted to life on land. So they have more stumpy legs for walking around, not really webbed toes. And in gopher tortoises, because they're adapted to digging burrows, they have these really well-developed, strong front legs for scooping sand and digging the burrows that they have. In North America, there are currently 6 species recognized of tortoises. The gopher tortoise is the only extant species still living that is east of the Mississippi River. So there's 3 different species of desert tortoises ranging from California and Nevada through Arizona and into some of the states of Mexico of Sonora and Sinaloa. There's the Bolson's tortoise, which wild populations are restricted to uplands in central northern Mexico, but there are reintroductions to North America. They disappeared from North America well before European settlement of that, but their historic range did include New Mexico and Texas. And so the Ted Turner Foundation has some reintroduction sites in New Mexico for the Bolson's tortoise, which is this Flavomarginatus right here. That's actually the closest relative to the gopher tortoise among all these groups, and they look quite a lot like gopher tortoises. And then in southern Texas and northeastern Mexico, there's the Texas tortoise, which is the smallest of this group. It's also probably the least studied of those groups of the groups of tortoises. But we'll focus on tortoises. Don't focus too much on the this range map. So this is an old range map. Tortoises are found pretty much throughout a lot of these gaps, especially as you go into peninsular Florida. You'll find tortoises, through the Kissimmee River Valley, just not in the wettest of those things, and you even find them on Cape Sable and Everglades National Park and down into Miami. So here's a better map of gopher tortoise distribution, sort of county by county, where they're in sort of southeastern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, southern Georgia, a little bit into South Carolina, and pretty much throughout the state of Florida. Every county in Florida has some historic populations of tortoises. They're not in the actual Keys, but Monroe County, where Cape Sable is, does have a population we've known about for at least 30 years. They seem to be hanging on. I don't know if they're doing great, but they are there. Habitat for tortoises. So tortoises evolved on the southeastern coastal plain, gopher tortoises did, with lightning ignited fires during the spring growing season. So frequent lightning, and before we had a lot of roads and other barriers to fire, you get lightning ignited fires starting in mid to late May or early June, after we've been dry for a couple months and everything's crispy. Plants are growing, and those fires would carry across the landscape, with a lot of these habitats being burned, every year, every other year, up to, less frequently burned scrub, which might have more woody vegetation. But those fires would thin out shrubs, mid-story, and the canopy and they thin out the ground cover, but allowing resprouting of grasses and herbaceous plants. So it allows a lot of the light that would normally be shaded out if you had a heavy canopy to reach the ground surface, reduces competition from those shrubby species, and you get a high diversity and abundance of grasses and herbaceous plants that are right there at tortoise level for tortoises to eat. Nowadays, we use prescribed fire to manage upland habitats as a primary tool because we don't want wildfires going across the landscape, and there's just a lot of anthropogenic barriers to fire. The other thing that's important for gopher tortoise habitat is the water table. So gopher tortoises need to burrow, and to dig a burrow, they generally need about the water table to be 12 inches or more below the surface. That doesn't mean that they won't dig a burrow in an area with a really shallow water table during the winter or the spring dry season when the water table has gone down up, and then in the summer the water table rises and those burrows are wet. So it's not uncommon, especially in South Florida, on some of these historically shallow soils, to go out in August or early September and see tortoises in burrows that have water up to the mouth. The tortoise will sit in the water as long as it's not totally flooded, and they'll just live in wet burrows. They seem to do fine with that. But historically, we think of them being in things like sandhill and really high dry habitats where there's several feet to the water table, and the burrows will be quite deep. Burrows end with a chamber at or below the water table, not always in really dry habitats. Sometimes they'll just stop and hang out there. But those burrows provide protection for tortoises from predators, but also protection from temperature extremes and humidity extremes. So the relative humidity can be 70 to 90% or higher. And the temperatures can be maintained year round, 65 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit down in the burrow. So they do like the same temperatures that humans do. I tell people that when they're out in the summer, relocating tortoises, that you might see a tortoise out walking around for a little bit in the afternoon, eating grass and foraging for, a half hour to an hour, but they don't want to be outside in the sun all day long, right? They might be out there and they'll go back in their burrow where it's dark and relatively cool. So same as us, we might be outside all day in the summertime, but we don't want to be in 85 to 90-degree temperatures constantly. A little bit at a time is good. All day is a bit brutal. And same for tortoises. Habitat types for tortoises. They're most commonly associated with dry uplands. So sandhill habitat is sort of historically considered the optimal habitat for gopher tortoises because both has really deep soils and an open canopy with lots of grasses on it. But you'll find them in mesic and xeric scrubby flatwoods. You'll find them in scrub habitat where the soils are nice and deep. There's just not as much grasses as you get in other habitats. You'll find them in dry prairies, but you also find them in coastal habitats on dunes and beaches. Barrier islands tend to have tortoise populations on them if they're large enough. And you'll find them in ruderal land, which just means any sort of uplands that are disturbed by humans, things that will get categorized as shrub and brushland or other types of habitat. You'll see them on roadsides, power line, utility rights of way, and so on. So here's just a handful of pictures of different habitats that you'll see a lot of variability in them, but what you see sort of consistently is relatively open canopies and herbaceous vegetation on here. So here's more of a grassy mesic flatwoods. Here's a little bit more, probably a little bit more mesic, getting scrubby with more palmetto cover, but still lots of herbaceous vegetation. And here's scrubby flatwoods where you do find tortoises in these habitats, but the densities might be a little bit lower because their herbaceous component on the ground is replaced to a large extent by shrubby oak species that provide less foraging opportunities. And then you'll see them in dry prairie like this, where there doesn't have to be canopy. Like, no canopy is okay for tortoises because when you live your life, 5 to 6 inches off the ground, pretty much everything's canopy if you have low shrubby palmettos. And again, you'll see them in scrub. Tortoises have good sand to dig in here, and but just probably a little bit less forage availability. And you do see them pretty frequently on these coastal barrier islands and coastal ecosystems. There's still plenty for them to eat. Sometimes their habitats, their home ranges might be long and linear to follow those coastal dunes where there are grasses. And if you go inland, they'll either hit buildings or maritime scrub or hammock on there. And they can swim. So it's not uncommon to see, especially on Facebook and things, people have video of tortoises swimming out, playing in the surf and going back in. So they're not really water turtles, but they do float. If they walk into the water, they just fill up their lungs, and that's how they get to the barrier islands. They may be washed up by the storms. I know, I think I saw George Heinrich on here. They've been studying tortoises on Egmont Key. And when Helene came through, some of the tortoises that they've been tracking wound up in Pinellas County. So those movements can be storm induced and frequently are, and tortoises can go from barrier islands onto the mainland and vice versa. So don't plop them in the water, but they can swim if need be. And this is very often what we do see tortoises in, where it's been cleared land that's upland, so the canopy's been reduced. You get a lot of grasses coming back, things like dog fennel, but the tortoises do just fine in these habitats as long as there's not excessive predation and stuff on the young tortoises. But the adults will do fine. There's plenty for them to eat and dig. So what makes high quality gopher tortoise habitat? Really, sort of what we look at for optimal things is where the soils have 18 inches or deeper down to the water table, and then an open canopy of less than 60% canopy cover, and generally high abundance and diversity of grasses and other herbaceous plants, especially nitrogen fixing plants such as legumes for young tortoises can foster rapid growth. So when a tortoise is born, it's only 1.5 to 2 inches long. Its shell isn't hard yet. It's soft. Everything can eat it. And the only way to sort of reduce that predation risk, other than hiding and digging in burrows, is to grow fast. And so young tortoises want to grow fast so they can get up to a size where their shell's harder and they're too big for a lot of predators to eat. I do want to point out that potential habitat, tortoise habitat, is not necessarily high quality. I showed some examples before of them, tortoise burrows on disturbed habitat. So tortoises show up in all sorts of weird things. We've seen tortoises move into dried up marshes in the winter and spring dry season because they can burrow in there and there's lots of grasses for them to forage on. But then when the rainy season comes and those areas flood, they'll move out of those. Other areas where people have tracked tortoises, they don't move back and forth between those habitats, but sometimes we have seen it. So they can be found in pretty weird areas. Here's a map where they did a species distribution model of gopher tortoise habitat within their range. And the areas of red are considered really high suitability for habitat. But I do caution people that this is an exercise where you're looking for sort of the best of the best habitat. It doesn't mean that these areas that are kind of gray in the intermediate areas in there, or even the areas that have low suitability, won't have tortoises in them. You do find tortoises in them. It just might be stuff that for the purposes of developing these models didn't have high suitability. So, but you will see areas that tend to have a lot of high dry habitat that's not been developed. So up along the Brooksville Ridge, a lot of high quality habitat, and sort of northeastern Manatee County and Sarasota County, lots of high quality habitat. And then down Cape Coral, Lee County, there's a lot of high quality habitat. And then, on the East Coast, Merritt Island, Cape Canaveral, there's a lot of good scrub habitat in those areas. But the tortoises are found throughout there. Again, they've seen tortoises, in Miami. Historically, they did occur along the coastal ridges down that far. And just sort of wrapping up the tortoise portion of this talk before I talk about some of our the skinks and then the research. Threats to tortoises, the main threats are habitat loss and then degradation of habitat that is exacerbated by fragmenting habitat. So development of habitat, making it difficult to put prescribed prescribed fire on the landscape and maintain those open canopies and high herbaceous components is definitely a threat. So not just losing the habitat, but those habitats not being managed. So we're in a situation right now in Florida and largely throughout the tortoises range that if humans aren't actively putting fire on the landscape or in other ways mechanically thinning canopy cover on it, the habitat will just tend to go to hammock habitats that get live oaks and other species of oaks that'll shade out the grasses and eventually make the habitats untenable for tortoises. And that's one of the reasons why you do see a lot of tortoises move out to roadsides and power line rights of ways, because those areas are frequently mowed and they keep the habitat, in terms of what a tortoise wants, nice and grassy. And so you'll see tortoises in those areas. I'm going to switch now. I didn't switch the background, but I'm going to switch now to talk about sand skinks and Florida sand skinks and blue-tailed mole skinks. So these are two closely related lizard species that are also threatened by development in Florida. The Florida sand skink is just 4 to 5 inches long. It's nearly legless. It does have front and back legs, but the front legs only have one toe on them. If you can see my pointer, the front legs are pretty small, and there's actually a little groove along the side of the body that they can just put their legs backwards and be off. The back legs are a little bit bigger. It's hard to see in this picture. And they have a whopping 2 toes on those limbs, but the limbs are very small. They're adapted to burrowing through loose, dry sand. So they're generally kind of sand colored. So sometimes pinkish, but usually sort of gray to tan colored. They have a wedge-shaped snout. They have small eyes. They don't have external ears, unlike most other lizards. And that helps them sort of swim through the sand. So they'll just slither like a snake, and they have very distinctive tracks that you'll see that they leave on there. The blue-tailed mole skink is a subspecies of the more broadly distributed mole skink, which is the sister species to sand skinks that I'll talk about. They're a little bit bigger. They get up to 6.5 inches long. And a lot of that's tail. So the tail, if it hasn't dropped its tail and is regrowing it, tends to be a little bit over half of the total length of the skink. They have small legs, but they do have all 5 toes on each foot if they haven't lost any. They tend to be brown in color, brown to tan in color. And the blue-tailed mole skinks, especially in the juveniles, will have a bright blue tail. It tends to be more of a powder blue than an electric blue, but the tails can fade to a salmon pink or light pink in adults, especially if they've dropped their tail as an anti-predator defense and they regrow it. They tend not to get the blue color back. The peninsula mole skink is the next most closely related subspecies to the blue-tailed mole skink, and they're not very easy to tell apart. Peninsula mole skinks, well, I've seen them with bluish tails, with purple tails, and with red tails. But generally speaking, unless you're counting scales and stuff like that, locality and location is the best way to tell those apart right now. So here's a picture of a blue-tailed mole skink that has a little bit more of a purple colored tail. I do want to point out, when I talk about these as a federally threatened species, people say, hey, I've seen these skinks and, my cat killed one. Juvenile southeastern 5-line skinks and other skinks other than sand skinks in this genus all have blue tails. They tend to be electric blue tails that are really bright and shiny, and the juveniles tend to have very dark black bodies and sort of these flame colored racing stripes on the head. So if you see these are much more stout bodied. They get a little bit bigger, but the hatchlings and juveniles of the more widely distributed southeastern 5-line skink do have these tails. But again, it's like if you go by that electric blue color, and they have stouter bodies, bigger legs, and you tend to find them if you're in urban habitats, unless you live on the Lake Wales Ridge. It's probably not a blue-tailed mole skink. So just looking at sort of the evolution, there's many species of skinks in this genus, but we have this outgroup here where the sand skink, Plestiodon reynoldsii, is closely related to the mole skink, which is Plestiodon egregius. And then there's several subspecies of the mole skink that have spread out. But both of these species evolved in peninsular Florida when sea levels were high. And the middle part of Florida was islands, a series of islands, sort of in the middle of what is now the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. And then the sand skinks with smaller legs have a harder time dispersing from there, but the mole skinks have sort of spread throughout the southeast, are a little bit easy. It's a little bit easier to disperse, and they're not quite as fossorial as the sand skinks. So just talking a little bit more about their evolution for sand skinks. Again, this don't pay attention to the species or genus names. This has been messed around with by taxonomists, but we'll see the sand skinks are sort of restricted to Central Florida on the Lake Wales Ridge, and then up into Ocala National Forest on the Mount Dora Ridge. They're also found in Winter Haven, just off the Lake Wales Ridge on here. Blue-tail mole skinks, again, the mole skinks I talked about before, kind of found throughout the southeastern United States into Alabama, Georgia, maybe South Carolina a little bit. And there are multiple subspecies of this. The blue-tail mole skink is considered the historic, or so the most ancient lineage that evolved on the Lake Wales Ridge, on the central and southern Lake Wales Ridge, and then radiated outwards. So the peninsula mole skink is sort of found out there. There's also another federally threatened species, the Keys mole skink, that's found only on the Keys, and is, as you might guess, really threatened by not just development, but sea level rise. There's a insular population here along Cedar Key, the Cedar Key mole skink, that's also been proposed for federal listing. That one may be in pretty rough shape with back-to-back hurricanes washing out Cedar Key in 2 years in a row. So they may be still hanging on in some places. And then the red-tailed mole skink farther north is a little bit more widespread. And here, again, just looking at the same paper, this is just showing some of these lineages where sort of these blue-tail mole skinks have sort of been on the ridges, and then these other subspecies have sort of radiated out from there. Conservation status of these species, again, both species were federally designated as threatened in 1987. For the mole skink, it was just the blue-tailed subspecies listed at that time. And then Florida just lists them as federally designated as threatened. So they just adopt the federal designation on there. And the reasons they were listed was for loss of habitat, destruction, modification of habitat throughout the range. They listed overutilization from collectors as a potential reason when they listed them in 1987. I don't think they're not super easy to find. I don't think there's a big market for people to keep pet sand skinks or blue-tailed mole skinks, to be honest. But really, other things are inadequate regulatory mechanisms to protect these species and improper habitat management. I'll cover some of the life history of these species quickly. Sand skinks eat small invertebrates. Both things eat small invertebrates. Sand skinks tend to eat more things that are under the leaf litter and sort of in the surface of the ground. So termites, beetle larvae, spiders, antlions. They're not specific about what prey they eat. They don't have any distinct preferences. They just sort of eat what's there. Mole skinks are a little bit more on the surface and in the leaf litter, so they're going to be eating more roaches, spiders, and crickets, and relatively fewer termites and antlions and things like that will be in the ground. Reproduction, they have distinct mating seasons. So sand skinks will mate between February through May in the spring season. And then they lay their eggs May through June There's not a lot of space in their bodies, so usually it's 2 eggs per female, sometimes 3 or 4, and they'll lay their eggs in the sand or under logs or other cover. And like all these skinks in the genus, the females stay with the eggs until they hatch. They don't do really any parental care after that, but they will tend the nests on that. Sand skink eggs hatch in July through September, and they can become sexually mature in their first year. Sometimes, probably more often the second, but within a year they can grow enough where they're sexually mature. Mole skinks, they do mate earlier, so they mate in late fall and the winter, and their egg laying occurs April through June. So when the sand skinks are breeding, the mole skinks are already have eggs in the ground, and they'll have larger clutch sizes, so 3 to 7 eggs per female. The nests are laid under stand, and again, they remain with the eggs until hatching, and they might become sexually mature in the first or second year. And the asterisks I have about these egg laying features for the mole skinks is because a lot of it is taken from the more broadly distributed peninsula subspecies, because we just don't know a lot. We don't have as many captures and museum records for the blue-tailed mole skink specifically. Demography, so looking at demographic rates, sand skinks, you get even sex ratios of males and females. We know they become sexually mature just looking at museum specimens around 45 millimeters from snout to the vent where the hind legs are. So again, less than a year. Their lifespan may be up to 10 or more years in the wild, but and that's based off mercury capture records at places like Archbold Biological Station, where they have long histories of that. But most frequently, you'll see tortoise or skinks that are about 2 years old in terms of the size class of what we're looking at. Their generation length, so how long it is between generations, tends to be about 4 years. So 49 months is estimated. And you'll get densities ranging from 50 to 260 individuals per acre. 260 individuals per acre does sound really high, but when you work it out by square feet, that's about one animal for an average size bedroom in a house. So it seems like a lot, but it's not like it's just skinks all over the place. We really don't know much about the demography of the blue-tailed mole skinks at all, really. What we have dispersal of skinks, it's very limited, as you might imagine, for a species that lives in really loose sand, swimming around. They don't hang out in that. I mean, they'll hang out in the loose sand, but they're not in open sand. Usually they're going to be traveling through it to other areas where there's leaf litter to do it. Field observations are that they'll move 35 to 140 meters on average. They have small home range sizes. But when you look at population genetics, there are going to be some long distance dispersal events, before there were roads in the way. Those are rare, but enough to sort of up to a kilometer, but maybe enough to have some genetic exchange. No real field measurements of dispersal on blue-tailed mole skinks, but the genetic data have similar patterns. And so there's not really any evidence of them moving between remaining habitat patches. So these populations of both species that are left are sort of just stuck with limited ability to disperse from one patch to the next between inhospitable habitat. I don't know why my slides are not advancing. Okay, so distribution, both species are limited to xeric habitats in Central Florida. The sand skink is found on the Lake Wales Ridge, the Winter Haven Ridge, and the Mount Dora Ridge. It's only found in 7 counties within the state and only found within Florida. The blue-tailed mole skink, that subspecies, is much more limited. There's really only 35, maybe a few more known localities for them. Almost all of those are on the Lake Wales Ridge. One is on the Winter Haven Ridge, but some people argue those might be the peninsular subspecies, and they're only found in 3 counties, in Highlands, Polk, and a little bit of Osceola County. So looking at the species ranges here, you'll see records of sand skinks throughout Highlands County up into a little bit into Putnam County or Marion and Lake counties. And then the blue-tailed moleskink on the right-hand side is going to be much more restricted, and there's only a few records in Osceola County. So if you get up to Orlando, that's pretty much too far north for them. And then their habitat, wrapping up sort of this part of the talk, their distribution and occurrence of sand skinks appears to be limited primarily by soils and elevation. They require these very well-drained xeric soils, typically found at elevations of 82 feet or higher above sea level, but sometimes as low as 70 feet above sea level. And then the vegetation cover and habitat condition tend to be poor predictors of presence and abundance of these skinks. So they're not really recommended for excluding areas that might be used by skinks, because if the habitat stops being managed, unlike scrub jays that might abandon those habitats and those territories, the sand skinks can't really go anywhere. So they might persist in, along trails and disturbed areas in those habitats. And then if you have it open up and clear cut or manage those habitats, they'll spread out a little bit more. And we do see that. They're typically associated with scrub, rosemary, oak, or sandpine scrub and turkey oak ridges or turkey oak barrens. But they are also found in sandhill habitats, and they've been documented from citrus groves, pastures, pine plantations, roadsides, and other disturbed sites. Leaf litter does seem to be important because it provides their arthropod prey, but when you look at microhabitat structure, you can see some contradictions across studies, and it might just be the spatial scale that they used, but they have sort of complex responses to soil and light conditions. So they tend to be in the sand, and they're probably moving around to areas where the temperature and the moisture content of the sand is good for them, where it's not too wet, but not so dry that it will dry them out. And so they do require patches of open and shaded areas, so they can probably thermoregulate in the sand. What we know about the blue-tailed moleskink is that their requirements are similar to the sand skink, but more restrictive. So you never find them at a site where there are not sand skinks for this subspecies. Peninsula moleskinks you'll find where there aren't sand skinks, but and they always seem to be less abundant than sand skinks where both occur. Usually we're seeing 7 times or more sand skinks in terms of numbers of individuals. And most of the localities, all but one known locality, are more than 100 feet above sea level. So they're much more restricted. Here's an example of habitat models that we built for both species in Polk County. It might look like they're really widespread, but these models were based only off of soils and elevation. So this is more of a historic distribution of where we might have expected to see them. It's not saying that they're this abundant or widespread in here. If you want a better idea of what natural habitats occur, what scrub habitats occur in this region, you can look at the scrub jay habitat model, where if you're looking at these dark green areas, there's a lot less dark and light green habitat because the natural habitats have been reduced by quite a large extent. Threats to the skink species, again, severe fragmentation of existing populations, continued decline in extent and quality of the habitat. Anywhere from 60 to 90% of the scrub ecosystems are estimated to have been lost to development and agriculture, probably, especially if you're talking about healthy scrub, much closer to 90%. Proper management of habitats is potentially more important for sand skink conservation than I don't know where that was going. Then sort of a lack of adding additional acreage or translocating those sites. And loss of genetic diversity is a particular threat, especially for blue-tailed moleskinks, because there's fewer populations of them, and fewer of those populations are in existing conservation lands. So moving on to threats for both tortoises and these skinks that are all both found in uplands, and uplands are where the people are going to, especially after hurricanes. We understand why we don't want to have houses in wetlands and low-lying areas, and wetlands do have some better protection measures for them. But if you look at sort of moderate growth projections, and this is getting a little outdated, but in 2010, we had 18.8 million people in Florida, and the moderate growth projection, so not the extreme one, by the Florida Bureau of Economic and Business Research, was that we'd have by 2070 33.7 million people. And that trend, I think, is we're staying right probably on that trend. And so the question becomes, where are we going to put these people? And they're not just, uniformly going throughout the state. So if you look at those projections regionally, yes, all parts of Florida are going to experience population growth, but South and Central Florida, relatively on a percent basis, are going to be seeing a lot more increase in populations than Northeast Florida and the Panhandle. All of Florida is experiencing development, but these areas in particular are seeing the highest rates of influx of new residents coming to the state, and that's projected. And so, just looking at this report, here's our baseline of people in the state, and just coarsely looking at sort of protected habitat being in green, red areas being developed habitat, and then other areas which are primarily agriculture or other land uses, timber, and those sorts of things would be the sort of light green color. This is what the state looked like in 2010. 2021, just for reference, we are already up to 21.9 million people. I don't know what our numbers are right now. But here's the projection based off of as business as usual development rates of what is going to be developed in Florida in 2070 with 33.7 million people. So you can see obviously a lot more red and pretty much spread out around surrounding these existing conservation lands that are already protected. And you can see here's the Lake Wales Ridge, this long, skinny, slightly slanted sort of backbone of the peninsula of Florida. It's pretty much solid red. A lot of it's been already lost to citrus and stuff, but those upland habitats still can support tortoises and sand skinks, especially if they're managed for those species. Once you put them in houses, it's not coming back, especially for the skinks. And then even the sort of best case scenario, so they had an alternative scenario where they focused on increasing density in developed areas and maintaining green space and emphasizing things like the wildlife corridor. You still see a lot of red, and that red, those developments are going to be happening in uplands. So the upland threats to these species, the development threats, aren't going away anytime soon. And when we look at, again, looking at this map of gopher tortoise habitat within the range, if you overlay that with protected habitats, you can see that some of these areas with high quality habitat, National Forest and Eglin Air Force Base up in the Panhandle is protected. This blue dot north of Tampa is with Wacoochee State Forest, largely some protected lands across Avon Park Air Force Range and the Southern Lake Wales Ridge, Babcock Webb, and some of these areas in Manatee County. But particularly a lot of this stuff, Cape Coral, Lee County, those tortoises have relatively high quality habitat and it's not protected. And when I train people to be authorized agents to relocate tortoises, a lot of that demand is coming from Southwest Florida, as well as now you're getting more citrus, Levy County people going a little bit north along the Brooksville Ridge where development is creeping north in those parts of the state. But even widespread throughout along the coastal ridges and the state, we're seeing tortoises being moved. So I'm going to wrap up quickly, and I have probably more slides than I'm going to discuss here on conservation measures for these species and contrasting them. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on tortoises. But for gopher tortoises, the conservation measures are primarily based on relocation and translocation to move individuals out of harm's way. So when development comes in, we need to move the tortoises out of those development areas and either relocate them on site if enough habitat is going to remain. And enough habitat is as defined by FWC, not necessarily by the biology of the species. Or they'll be translocated, which just basically means off-site relocation to an entirely new area outside the individual's original home range. For skinks, the primary conservation measure is conservation banks, where those are primarily privately owned lands that are set aside and have dedicated funds and management for those species. And that's mitigation for loss of habitat. So skinks, you can translocate them, but catching them and moving them is pretty difficult and labor intensive. So it's not a no net loss sort of scenario here. So for 1 acre that's impacted by development, they have to purchase 2 acres protected somewhere else to offset those impacts. And it does seem to work for skinks. You do have a net loss of some habitat on there, but you can protect entire viable populations of skinks on these conservation banks. And the sand skink has been proposed by the service for delisting from the Endangered Species Act, no longer being considered a threatened species. That's not true for the blue-tailed mole skink, which is still a lot more rare. So they'll still do in at least Osceola, Polk, and Highlands County, they still do conservation banking for both species, but really using the sand skink as a surrogate for blue-tailed mole skink protection. What Wildlands is doing research-wise, primarily for gopher tortoises, is we're focused on understanding the scale and scope of translocations, and then we're starting to look into what success measures are on recipient sites for gopher tortoises, where most tortoises get moved. For skinks, a lot of it is focused really just on updating species distribution models and getting a better grasp of the current status and distribution of sand skinks and blue-tailed mole skinks. I realized I didn't have a lot of time in this talk to sort of discuss some of the results of those, but we did finish up 4 years of research range-wide doing some occupancy modeling for sand skinks. For gopher tortoises, I'm just going to sort of really breeze through what we're looking at with the distribution of tortoises and look at sort of how translocation might be affecting the tortoise throughout its range. So yes, the tortoise is distributed throughout the southeastern coastal plain, but there is some structure to that distribution. And so if you look at sort of population genetics historically, you can see sort of broad regional differences in the genetic structure of these populations. And that's used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to look at these sort of analysis units for assessing where populations and how well populations are doing sort of throughout these representative units in the range. And so in that distribution analysis by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, this doesn't include a lot of private lands. In fact, most private lands aren't on here, but they identified 656 local populations, and then they would rank them based off of how many adults were in those populations. So either high resilient populations where they had more than 250 adults, moderate where it was 50 to 250 adults, or low. And so you'll see that some of these areas have a lot more of these sort of orange dots or stars with small populations. And then other areas, particularly Southwest Georgia and Peninsula Florida, have a higher proportion of resilient populations that are on here. Their estimate was 150,000 tortoises range wide. Again, that's not counting a lot of tortoises that may be on private lands. And then just looking throughout these regions, not very many tortoises in the western portion of the range or the western panhandle in Alabama. But 26% of the tortoises are in southeast Georgia and eastern panhandle. 20% are in southeast Georgia, before I said southwest, South Carolina and Jacksonville area. And then, almost 50% of tortoises populations are found in the peninsula of Florida. So the bulk of those populations are in there. And so what we're really focused is, we're moving tortoises to mitigate for impacts to them. Are we moving them where they should be going? And so if we look at permitting trends, so relocation permits for tortoises, going back to 2009 have sort of exponentially increased. The 2022 data weren't even complete there. It seems to have plateaued. But if we look at the trends from 2009 through 2022, we've moved 87, almost 88,000 tortoises. We're probably getting close to, in the last 2 years, that number is probably getting very close to 100,000 tortoises being moved over the last 15 years. 88%, so almost 98% of those tortoises, 77,000, have been moved off-site to recipient sites, so not within their original home range. In acres protected, 2009 through 2021, 280,000 acres that had tortoise burrows on them have been impacted by development, and 53,000 acres have been protected as recipient sites. Now, that's not apples to apples because the recipient sites have much higher quality habitat than these other acres, but you can see that tortoises are being squeezed onto less land. And when we look at those by population size, we're moving, if the y-axis here is numbers of individuals moved, those other numbers are how many populations there are. We're moving over 10,000 tortoises a year in 2021, 2022, and it's about the same for 2023 and probably 2024. I don't have those numbers. And then the shading is based off of the size of populations that are on the permit. So you'll see, starting really 2019 through 2022, there has been 2 permits per year that have moved populations of more than 250 tortoises entirely on a single permit. So that's like moving an entire viable population. And, and 15, 25, 26 permits where you're moving 50 to 250 tortoises on a permit. Most of the permits are relatively small numbers, but we're moving large numbers of tortoises across the state. And so that's like moving one of these green dots for these highly resilient, or moving 25 of these blue dots across the state to somewhere else. That's going to have impacts. And so what we're looking at is sort of, where are they going? If you look at how many tortoises are being moved out of counties, you can see at a county scale, they're being moved out of the I-4 corridor. Orange County has the most tortoises going out. You can look at where they're going to, and Osceola County actually has had the most tortoises moved to them through these recipient site programs. And you can kind of look at net change, but most counties are losing tortoises, and only a few counties are gaining them by having established recipient sites. And then we're sort of looking at where these tortoises are going to, what neighboring counties they're going to, and likewise, you can look at where they're going in from. And I'm just going to sort of finish up quickly here. So what we'll do is, if you try to do that all at once, it gets messy. And so we use network analysis to sort of build a translocation network and look at this system of where tortoises have been being moved from. And so we looked at it at a county level scale. And here's just an example of sort of where tortoises are going and being moved from. And they're colored based off of those regional units that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service looked at in the past. And so we have this big, messy translocation network that is sort of built up over time. I'm going to skip over that. But if you look at sort of the structure of it, you still see some regional structure where peninsula tortoises tend to stay in the peninsula and panhandle tortoises tend to stay in the panhandle, but that's breaking down a little bit over there. I'm sort of pretty much out of time, but what we do see is a net loss of tortoises in peninsular Florida from them being moved from development. The implications are that, tortoises are being translocated on a massive scale in Florida. We really don't know the outcomes on recipient sites, and that this network analysis is really useful for sort of understanding these spatial and temporal patterns in movements of tortoises, potential conservation implications maybe related to genetics of local tortoise populations, and sort of the resilience of that network to being moved on. So that is sort of translated into more outreach to sort of reduce disturbed site permits and stuff like that, that I'll sort of skip around, that we've been working with with FWC, but we're working with local governments to sort of build up sort of a network and let fewer tortoises fall through the cracks in these. That's what we're working on right now. But the last thing I wanted to highlight right as we're hitting 3 o'clock is one of the things Wildlands has done is we got a specialty gopher tortoise license plate that will generate funds. The background of the slide is the artwork for the plate. Hopefully this QR code still works. Otherwise, I can send you a link or you can go to our website. But we have reached the minimum number of vouchers that we need to sell. So the state's going to start producing them. Hopefully within the next 6 months, those plates will be available at DMVs. And that'll help us do more of this research and hopefully help sort of identify areas to improve outcomes for tortoises on here. So are there any questions? I know I used up pretty much the whole time, but I'm happy to take any questions now.
There were a few questions in the chat. I think they all accidentally got sent to me directly though. So one of them was from Teresa, and she says, it's so disheartening to see this development in Florida. Would you say that there is any hope of survival for the species that we've talked about today?
Yes, I think, well, certainly in our lifetimes, tortoises live as long as we do. So yes, but the concern I have is that they're going to be very restricted to things that you can have for the skinks, especially at least for the sand skinks. I think because they don't have huge home ranges and because they have relatively short lifespans, you can manage habitat for them and you can keep viable populations on properties that are a couple hundred acres. And with these banks, they have dedicated management funds. So that's even stronger protection than you get on a lot of state lands where the management funds are subject to political will. For the conservation banks, those management funds are put into endowments that are invested with a high enough principal that the interest should pay for long-term management. And you can only spend that money at that property to do things like prescribed fire or thinning and invasive plant control. So, but they're going to be much more restricted, and we may have little zoos. For tortoises, I think the picture is a little bit less rosy. I'm not worried about tortoises going extinct sort of soon, but if you look at range wide, their populations aren't doing well. And because their generation length for tortoises is 20 to 30 years, very similar to people, the trends that you're seeing are hard to detect. And so you might still see, and a lot of people are, like I see tortoises everywhere, but you're seeing adult tortoises everywhere, and they'll breed even as old females and stuff like that. And they'll lay eggs and you might see hatchlings, but you don't see a lot of recruitment. And we're seeing, more sort of unanticipated effects. George was on here. We're seeing more, predation by dogs, predation by coyotes that have really expanded in Florida as human populations have expanded. So I think for all of these species, it's going to require human intervention to maintain and manage these habitats. And to keep the populations going. I think if you just walked away from these and just stopped development, it wouldn't be a good outlook for these species because the natural processes that maintain their habitats have disappeared. And so it requires us to do that. So really long scale, not great, but I think, some of these species are, they're going to be around for a long time. The question is, how well represented are they going to be throughout their range? And, are people going to be able to see these species? Most people never see a sand skink in their lives because, you have to dig them up and trap them. You see tracks. But with tortoises, the plus side is that they do okay on people's lawns, and they're less habitat specific than the lizards. But to have a viable population long term, I think a lot of times you see sort of the Walking Dead. It's like a retirement community for tortoises in lawns and stuff like that, and they'll hang on. But when those adults die, there's no juveniles coming back to replace them, and then eventually they're going to be only found on conservation lands that are well managed. So, sorry, I can't I can't be a lot more positive than that, but they'll be around. We just have to keep working um, to maintain those populations, and they might require some interventions to keep them going. So we're beyond a point where we can just sort of fix it and walk away. It's not like Eagles and DDT where we know what the problem was and we know what some of the effects of pollution were, and you can correct those situations, and then the population sort of recover on their own. I don't think that's likely to happen for any of these species. They're going to require habitat management for that.
All right, so that was the only question in the chat. There were a few comments about things need to change, and hopefully there's some educational programs for kids here in Florida to learn more about. Go ahead.